My own son marched into my home with a lawyer, waving papers to have me declared incompetent. He thought he'd strip me of everything I built. But when I walked into that office with 3 judges I went to law school with, the look on his face was priceless. He realized in that moment he wasn't about to bury me. He was about to bury himself. I'll never forget the day my own son tried to strip me of my dignity. It was a quiet Tuesday morning. I had just finished my usual walk around the neighborhood, the kind I take to clear my head and keep the blood flowing. At 68 I may move a little slower than I did in my 40s, but my mind is as sharp as ever. I still balance my accounts to the penny. I still write with the precision I honed after decades in law. That morning I came home to find Daniel waiting for me, sitting on my porch with a man in a tailored suit. Daniel didn't even greet me with a hello. He stood up, smirked, and said, "Dad, this is Mr. Collins. He's here to help settle some legal matters." I knew right then something wasn't right. Mr. Collins carried a leather briefcase and the smug look of a man who thought he was already in control. They both followed me inside without asking, as if my home already belonged to them. Daniel wasted no time. He placed a thick stack of papers on my kitchen table. "Dad," he said, his voice dripping with false concern, "this is for your own good. We've all noticed you've been forgetful lately. It's nothing to be ashamed of, but you can't keep handling finances on your own. These documents will make things easier, safer." I sat down, my hand resting on the table, steady as ever. Forgetful? That was the excuse? I'd spent years managing more complicated estates than my son could dream of. But Daniel kept talking, like a salesman rehearsing his pitch. "This is just a petition for guardianship. If you sign, I'll be able to manage your accounts, pay the bills, keep you comfortable. You won't have to stress about anything." I didn't touch the papers. I didn't even glance at them. Instead, I studied his face. I saw not concern but calculation. He was 35, ambitious, and always reaching for more than he could handle. I'd bailed him out of debt twice already, and now, here he was trying to take control of everything I'd built with my own 2 hands. Mr. Collins finally spoke, his tone polished and intimidating. "Mr. Whitaker, this is a standard legal procedure. Many families make these arrangements when elders can no longer manage their affairs. It's best to agree before the courts step in." I leaned back in my chair and let out a slow breath. Elders. That word burned. They were treating me like a piece of property to be transferred, not a man who had raised a family, built a career, and kept his wits about him every single day. I didn't argue. Not yet. I simply folded my hands, looked Daniel straight in the eye, and asked, "And what happens if I don't sign?" His smirk widened. "Then I'll let the courts decide, Dad. And trust me, it won't end well for you." That was the moment the war began. When Daniel left my house that morning, I knew the matter was far from over. He thought his threats would rattle me, but I stayed calm, at least on the outside. Inside, though, a storm brewed. I had raised that boy, clothed him, paid for his schooling, and given him every advantage, and now he wanted to paint me as weak and incapable. But it wasn't just about the paperwork anymore. Daniel wanted to break me in front of everyone who mattered to me. I found that out the following weekend. My extended family gathered at my sister's home for her birthday. It was a tradition, one of the few times a year the whole family came together. Cousins, nieces, nephews, neighbors, they were all there. I arrived early, carrying a bottle of wine I'd been saving. But as soon as I walked in, I noticed the shift. Conversations hushed. Smiles faded. People gave me those looks, polite, sympathetic, but tinged with doubt. I didn't have to wonder long why. Daniel had beaten me there. He stood in the living room, tall and confident, surrounded by a small crowd of relatives. His voice carried across the room, smooth and convincing. "I love my father. I really do," he said, shaking his head like a grieving son. "But he's just not the same anymore. He forgets things. He repeats himself. He even left the stove on last week." A few gasps followed. Lies, all of them. I hadn't left the stove on in decades. I had always been careful, maybe too careful, especially since losing my wife. My routines were precise, deliberate, but in that moment, none of it mattered. The seed of doubt had already been planted. When I stepped into the room, Daniel's eyes met mine, and his smile widened. He wanted me to hear every word. He wanted them to see me as the man he described. A burden, an old fool. I stood there, holding the bottle of wine, while my nieces avoided my gaze, and my brother-in-law gave me a pitying pat on the shoulder. At dinner, the humiliation grew sharper. I sat at the end of the table, where I'd always sat, but the conversations flowed around me, as though I wasn't there. Daniel spoke loudly about next steps in handling family affairs, his lawyer's name dropping casually into the discussion. My own family members nodded as though he were the responsible one, the savior. I could feel the walls closing in. Every laugh, every whisper, a reminder of how easily reputation can be stolen. The final blow came when my sister, bless her heart, leaned over and whispered, "Tom, maybe you should let Daniel help. It might be easier for everyone." She meant well, but her words cut deeper than any knife. It wasn't just Daniel against me anymore. It was the family, my family, the people I had spent a lifetime protecting and providing for. They were ready to believe I was failing. I didn't argue, not once. I kept my mouth shut, even when Daniel, with that smug look, raised his glass and said, "To making sure Dad is taken care of, whether he realizes he needs it or not." The table erupted in polite applause. I lifted my glass too, but not in agreement. Inside, I was making a promise to myself. They thought I was beaten. They thought they could strip me of dignity in front of everyone I loved. But I knew something Daniel had forgotten. I wasn't just his father. I wasn't just a man getting older. I was Thomas Whitaker, attorney, strategist, and survivor. I had fought battles in courtrooms, nastier than this, against men smarter and richer than him, and every time, I had come out stronger. I left that night quietly, walking to my car without a word. Daniel probably thought my silence meant surrender. He couldn't have been more wrong. That was the night I decided, if my son wanted war, I would give him one he could never win. Driving home from my sister's birthday dinner, I kept replaying every word Daniel had said. The lies, the smug tone, the way the family nodded along as if I were some fragile old man. My knuckles tightened on the steering wheel. But as I pulled into my driveway and parked beneath the old oak tree, the anger gave way to something heavier. Memories. I thought back to the long road that had brought me here. Every sacrifice, every decision I had made was for Daniel, and now that same son wanted to bury me alive while I was still breathing. I grew up with nothing. My father worked in a steel mill until the day his lungs gave out, and my mother scrubbed floors to keep us fed. College was a dream no one in my family ever spoke of, but I made it happen. I worked nights stocking shelves, studied law by day, and clawed my way through every exam with grit and prayer. When I graduated, I didn't celebrate for myself. I celebrated because it meant I could finally give my family more than survival. When Daniel was born, I swore his life would be different. I remember the first time I held him in the hospital room, his tiny fingers curling around mine. I whispered a promise. He would never know hunger, never worry about rent, never feel the shame of hand-me-down shoes like I did. And I kept that promise, even when it broke me in other ways. When my law firm was just starting, I took cases no one else wanted. Long nights defending clients who could barely pay, sitting across from judges who doubted me because of where I came from. I built a name the hard way, brick by brick, while Daniel slept in a warm bed and went to schools I could only dream of at his age. I remember working until 2 in the morning, tiptoeing into his room when I finally got home, just to watch him sleep. I missed his first school play because I was in court fighting for a client who couldn't afford anyone else. The guilt tore at me, but I told myself it was worth it because everything I earned was for him. When he was accepted into college, I paid every penny of his tuition without hesitation. He never had to take out loans. When he wanted to start a business in his 20s, I mortgaged part of my own home to fund it. That business failed in less than a year. I didn't scold him. I didn't shame him. I told him failure was part of the process. I covered his debts and gave him another chance. Then there was the time he racked up credit card bills trying to impress a girl. I bailed him out again, telling myself it was just youthful foolishness. He'll grow out of it, I said. He'll learn responsibility in time. But responsibility never came. Entitlement did. Every sacrifice I made didn't teach him gratitude. It taught him that no matter what mistakes he made, I would always fix them. The hardest sacrifice of all came when my wife fell ill. Medical bills piled up faster than I could pay them. I sold my boat, the one luxury I ever bought for myself, and downsized my car. Daniel was grown by then, but instead of helping, he asked me for another loan. I gave it to him anyway, while I spoon-fed his mother in the hospital. She passed before she could see what he has become. Maybe it's a blessing she didn't live to see this betrayal. As I sat in my living room that night, surrounded by the silence of a house I had built with my own 2 hands, I thought of every sacrifice, every hour of sleep lost, every dollar spent on him instead of myself, every dream I put on the shelf so his could take center stage. And now, the same son I lifted up at every turn was trying to tear me down. He wanted the house, the savings, the legacy I bled for. To him, I wasn't a father anymore. I was an obstacle standing in the way of his greed. The weight of that truth pressed on me like a stone on my chest, but instead of breaking me, it hardened something inside me. He thought I was too old, too weak to fight. He thought time had dulled my edge. What he didn't know, what he could never understand, was that the man who sacrificed everything for his family was still the same man who had fought his way out of nothing. And if I could survive that, I could survive him. I stood up that night, walked to my desk, and opened the old leather drawer where I kept my law school diploma. I stared at the certificate, the ink faded but still proud, and I whispered to myself, "Thomas, you didn't come this far to let your own son bury you." Daniel had declared war, but he had forgotten. I was the one who taught him how to fight in the first place. The weeks after my sister's birthday dinner were some of the hardest of my life. Not because of what Daniel had done, but because of the whispers that followed me everywhere. A lie doesn't need proof to take root. It just needs repetition. And Daniel repeated his story to anyone who would listen. I first noticed it at the grocery store. A neighbor I'd known for 30 years, Mrs. Parker, smiled at me with that same pitying look I'd seen at the family gathering. "Tom," she said softly, "are you getting the help you need? These years can be hard." I forced a smile and told her I was fine, but inside I was burning. Help? I didn't need help. I needed my son to stop poisoning the well of my reputation. Not long after, I walked into the local diner. I'd been eating there since my 20s, and the waitress Millie usually greeted me with a hug and a free refill before I even asked. That day she hesitated. "Coffee, Mr. Whitaker?" she asked carefully, as if I might not remember what I wanted. The look in her eyes told me everything. Daniel had been there too. I later found out from an old friend at church that Daniel had been telling people I was slipping. "Your dad forgets things," he'd say, shaking his head like he was heartbroken. "He repeats himself, doesn't pay bills on time. I'm just trying to make sure he doesn't end up homeless or taken advantage of." It was clever, in a disgusting way. By framing himself as the concerned son, he made me look like a stubborn old man who didn't know what was good for him. Even at church, where I had taught Sunday school and served on the finance committee, the false narrative spread. One Sunday, the pastor gently suggested I let others handle some of my responsibilities. "You've carried the load long enough," he said. But the way he said it, the way his hand rested on my shoulder, told me Daniel had already been in his ear. My son was rewriting my life story, one quiet conversation at a time. The worst of it came when I received a letter in the mail from the county clerk. Daniel had filed a formal petition to declare me legally incompetent. My own son was trying to convince the court system that I couldn't manage my own life. Reading those words, "incompetent to handle financial and personal affairs," was like being stabbed in the chest. I had spent 40 years in law. I had drafted wills, advised clients, argued cases, and stood in courtrooms where men half my age stumbled over their words. And now Daniel wanted to brand me as unfit. It was a masterstroke of manipulation. He painted me as a fragile old man, losing his memory, too stubborn to admit it. To my family, my neighbors, even my community, he looked like the dutiful son trying to protect his father from himself. And the more I stayed silent, the more believable his story became. But silence can be a weapon too. I knew if I lashed out, if I shouted and raged, I'd look exactly like the senile old man he was trying to portray. No, I couldn't fight him on his terms. I had to let him build his case, brick by brick, lie by lie, because when the time came, I would tear the whole thing down in one stroke. Still, the pain of it cut deep. Each day I woke up to a world that saw me through Daniel's lies. People crossed the street to avoid awkward conversations. Old friends looked at me with soft, apologetic eyes. Even my sister called one evening and said, "Tom, maybe it wouldn't be so bad if Daniel helped. You deserve rest." Rest, that word stung almost as much as incompetent. I sat alone that night, staring at the petition papers spread across my desk. My own blood had turned the world against me, using my age as a weapon. He thought he could rewrite my story before I was even gone, but what Daniel didn't know, what he couldn't possibly understand, was that the man he was trying to bury was still breathing, still thinking, still planning. Let him spread his lies. Let him build his false empire on the backs of whispers and pity. When the truth came out, it would hit harder than he could ever imagine. I realized quickly that if I wanted to win this war, I had to play it differently than Daniel expected. He thought I would fight loud and angry, shouting at family gatherings, or storming into court with nothing but pride and hurt feelings. That's how he wanted it to play out. He wanted me to look unhinged, unstable, too emotional to be trusted. But I've been in too many courtrooms, seen too many desperate men fall into that trap. No, I wasn't going to hand him the performance he was hoping for, so I chose silence. It wasn't easy. Every fiber of me wanted to stand up in that diner, in that church, in front of every relative and shout the truth. I wanted to tell them how Daniel was lying, how every story he told was a carefully rehearsed script. But I bit my tongue. Instead, I played into his arrogance. I let him think his words were working. At family dinners, I sat quiet, letting the younger ones whisper and nod toward Daniel when he made comments about Dad's forgetfulness. I didn't correct them when they asked if I needed help remembering medication or paying bills. I nodded politely, even smiled. If Daniel wanted me to play the fool, I decided to play it better than he ever imagined. And something remarkable happened. The more I stayed silent, the more careless he became. Daniel mistook my calm for weakness. He grew bolder. He told more lies, stretched them further, and stopped worrying about covering his tracks. He began boasting openly to his friends that soon he'd be in charge of the estate. He told his wife that once the paperwork was final, they'd have the house sold within 6 months. I knew this not because he told me, but because word always finds its way back when someone gets greedy. Meanwhile, my silence wasn't wasted. Each day, I kept my mind sharp. I wrote down dates, conversations, names of people Daniel spoke to. I reviewed old case files from my years as an attorney, not because I needed the practice, but because I wanted the evidence to be overwhelming when the time came. I even started carrying a small notebook, jotting down grocery lists, chess scores, bank balances, proof of memory, proof of clarity, proof that I wasn't the man Daniel claimed I was. Daniel saw an old man fading, but what I was really doing was building a wall of patience brick by brick. I knew when the moment came to strike, I wouldn't just defend myself. I would crush the entire false narrative he had built. It wasn't all strategy, though. Some nights, the silence felt heavier than I could bear. Sitting alone in my living room, I thought of my wife. She always told me that silence was my greatest weapon, that I never needed to shout to be heard. I could almost hear her voice saying, "Wait, Tom, let him show the world who he really is." That memory gave me strength, and so I waited. When Daniel came over to check in, acting like the benevolent son, I let him lecture me. "Dad, you need to face reality," he'd say, pretending concern. "The sooner you let me handle things, the smoother life will be for you." I would nod, smile faintly, and offer no resistance. He left every time with a smirk, convinced I was slipping further into his trap. What he didn't know was that every nod, every smile, every quiet evening I let pass without protest was part of a plan. He thought silence meant surrender, but I knew silence meant power. The louder he shouted about my incompetence, the more obvious his greed would become. The more he pushed, the more reckless he would grow. And when that moment came, when he overstepped, I would be ready. Because silence isn't weakness. Silence is waiting for the right time to speak. And when I spoke, the entire room would listen. Once I chose silence as my shield, the next step was to gather my sword. Daniel believed he had me cornered, but he forgot one simple truth. I had spent a lifetime learning how to prepare for battles like this. I might not have been in the courtroom anymore, but my instincts were still sharp, my memory still precise. And if he wanted to drag me into a legal war, I was going to show him just how dangerous it was to underestimate me. The first thing I did was get my house in order, literally. I went through every drawer, every cabinet, every box in the attic. I pulled out deeds, titles, and bank statements, the physical proof of everything I had built and managed over the years. One by one, I organized them into neat files. Mortgages paid, loans cleared, investments thriving. If Daniel tried to argue I couldn't manage my affairs, I wanted the evidence to scream otherwise. I made copies of everything, 2 sets in fact. One I kept in my study, locked in the safe. The other I gave to my old friend Henry Lawson, a retired judge I trusted like a brother. "Hold on to these," I told him. "If anything happens to me, make sure they see the truth." Henry looked me in the eye, his weathered face firm, and said, "Tom, I'll make sure of it. You're not alone in this fight." But I didn't stop with paperwork. I knew Daniel's narrative rested on the idea that my mind was failing, so I set out to prove, without a shadow of doubt, that I was as sharp as ever. I started recording details of my daily life, balancing my checkbook down to the cent, writing letters to friends in clear, precise language, even entering chess tournaments at the community center. Each match I won, I kept the scorecards. Each financial transaction I handled, I made copies. It was tedious, yes, but it gave me the kind of undeniable proof no court could ignore. I also reached out quietly to colleagues from my law days. Some were still practicing, others retired, but every one of them knew me well enough to vouch for my clarity. I asked them to write letters, attesting to my soundness of mind and memory. A few even agreed to stand by me if this fight reached the courtroom. Meanwhile, I began to keep a close eye on Daniel himself. If I was gathering proof of my competence, I wanted to gather proof of his incompetence too. I tracked down records of the money I'd given him for his failed business ventures, old loan documents with my signature as guarantor, bank transfers where I had bailed him out of debt. I built a file thicker than the one he had tried to shove in front of me with his lawyer, a file that told the story of a man who wasn't protecting his father, he was exploiting him. The more I dug, the more I realized Daniel's greed wasn't a sudden shift. It had been there all along. growing quietly while I looked the other way. Every failure of his, every loan I covered, every debt I paid had only fed it. Now he thought he was strong enough to turn on the very man who carried him. But in his arrogance he had left a trail wide enough for anyone to see. Henry came by one evening as I laid everything out across the dining room table. "You've built a case stronger than most I ever saw in my years on the bench," he said, shaking his head in admiration. "When this comes to light, your son won't just lose. He'll never recover from the humiliation." That was the point. I didn't just want to win. I wanted Daniel to understand that betrayal has consequences, especially when it's aimed at the man who taught you everything you know. As I slid the final piece of paper into the folder, I felt a calm certainty settle over me. I wasn't rushing. I wasn't panicking. I was preparing. Every detail, every document, every ally was another nail in the coffin of Daniel's false narrative. He thought I was slipping. He thought I was fading into confusion and weakness. But what I was really doing was sharpening the blade of truth. Slowly, quietly, patiently. And when the moment came, I would strike in a way he could never forget. In times of betrayal, the world feels smaller. Family turns cold, neighbors whisper, and even the church pew you've sat in for decades feels unfamiliar. But just when I felt most alone, a hand reached out to steady me. That hand belonged to Henry Lawson. Henry and I went back more than 40 years. We met in law school, two poor boys trying to prove we belonged among men with family names carved into courthouses. We shared textbooks, lived off instant coffee, and swore we'd never forget where we came from. Henry rose to become a respected judge, firm but fair, the kind of man people trusted. He retired a few years before me, but his reputation never dimmed. In this storm, he was exactly the ally I needed. When I first told him what Daniel had done, Henry's eyes darkened with anger. "Your boy doesn't know the man he's dealing with," he said, his voice low but steady. "Tom, I've seen grown men crumble in your cross-examinations. If Daniel thinks you've lost your edge, he's in for the fight of his life." His confidence lifted me. Still, I didn't want him to fight my battles. "Henry, I don't want to drag you into this mess," I told him one evening as we sat in my study, files spread across the table. "It's my fight, my son, my burden." But Henry leaned forward, his hand pressing firmly against mine. "Tom, listen to me. Betrayal this deep doesn't belong to just one man. It poisons everything it touches. If Daniel succeeds, it won't just strip you. It'll tell every son and daughter out there that it's acceptable to rob their parents of dignity when they get older. No, this isn't just your fight. It's a fight worth standing beside you for." He wasn't just words either. Henry brought action. He reached out to two other judges we both knew from law school, men whose respect I had earned decades ago, men who had watched me argue cases long after Daniel was even born. They agreed to stand with me if needed, to testify that my mind was sound, that my judgment remained intact. 3 men with robes in their past, their integrity unquestioned, ready to vouch for me. It was a shield stronger than anything Daniel could muster. Henry also gave me something more subtle: validation. Each time we met, he challenged me with sharp questions like we were back in the classroom. What year was the landmark case Brown v. Board of Education decided? He'd throw at me mid-conversation. Who was the dissenting justice in Plessy v. Ferguson? I fired back the answers without hesitation, and he'd smile, satisfied. Sharp as ever, he'd say. These weren't just tests, they were proof, small victories that rebuilt my confidence. It reminded me that while Daniel was busy weaving lies, I had allies who knew the truth, allies who had seen my sharpness firsthand, allies who owed me nothing but still stood with me out of loyalty and respect. One Sunday, I decided to walk into church with Henry at my side. The whispers quieted as soon as people saw us. They knew his face, they knew his reputation, and when he greeted me like an equal, not like an invalid, heads turned. It was a subtle shift, but I felt the tide beginning to change. Daniel's lies had power in silence, but truth carries weight when spoken by the right voices. Later that afternoon, Henry said something that stuck with me. "Tom, betrayal by blood cuts deepest, but loyalty from a true friend heals stronger. You've given so much to people who don't appreciate it. Let someone stand for you this time." That night I sat alone in my kitchen, a cup of coffee warming my hands. I thought about Daniel's smirk, the way he looked at me as if I were already buried. But now I also thought about Henry's steady eyes, his unwavering belief in me. And for the first time since this ordeal began, I didn't feel like an old man fighting a losing battle. I felt like a man with an army, however small, behind him. Daniel had his lawyer. I had men of integrity who knew me better than he ever would. The game was shifting, and when the time came, my loyal ally would be standing right beside me as we turned Daniel's arrogance into his downfall. Daniel thought he had me cornered. After weeks of parading his lies through the family and community, he He called me one morning with a voice full of false kindness. "Dad," he said, "we need to settle this before it gets messy. I've scheduled a meeting with Mr. Collins at his office tomorrow afternoon. If you just sign the papers, it'll all be easier for you. No stress, no courtroom. Easier for me." That phrase rang in my ears like a bell. He wasn't offering me peace. He was offering me surrender. I didn't argue. I told him I'd be there. He hung up sounding smug, convinced the game was over. But what Daniel didn't know was that I had been building my moment. My silence, my patience, my hours of preparation, all of it had been leading to this, and I wasn't walking into that office alone. The next day, I put on my best Navy suit, the same one I used to wear when I stood before juries. I pressed the cuffs, polished the shoes, and stared at myself in the mirror. My face carried lines it didn't have 30 years ago, but my eyes were still steady. I wasn't going there as some broken old man. I was going as Thomas Whitaker, attorney and father, ready to reclaim my dignity. When I arrived at Collins' office, Daniel was already there, leaning back in his chair like he owned the place. Papers were spread neatly across the polished oak table. Collins sat beside him, briefcase open, glasses perched low on his nose. They both looked up as I walked in. "Dad," Daniel said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "good of you to come. Let's make this simple." Before I could reply, the door opened behind me. Henry Lawson stepped in, followed by Judges McCarthy and Reynolds, two men I'd known since law school. Their presence filled the room instantly. These weren't just old friends, they were men whose words carried weight, whose reputations demanded respect. Daniel's smile faltered. Collins shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Gentlemen," I said, pulling out a chair and sitting down, "thank you for joining me. I thought it would be wise to have some trusted colleagues present." Henry gave a polite nod, his gaze fixed on Collins. McCarthy and Reynolds sat on either side of me, their very presence a wall Daniel couldn't climb. Collins cleared his throat. "Mr. Whitaker, this meeting is to discuss the guardianship petition your son has filed. He has concerns regarding your ability to manage your affairs." I leaned forward, my voice calm but firm. "Concerns, you say? Then perhaps you'd like to hear from men who have known me for over 4 decades. Men who have presided over courtrooms where I argued cases, men who've seen my mind at work. Do I look incompetent to you, gentlemen?" Reynolds spoke first, his deep voice steady. "Not in the slightest. In fact, Tom has been helping advise young lawyers at the community center. I can't think of a sharper mind." McCarthy followed, his tone blunt. "This is a waste of everyone's time. If Thomas Whitaker is incompetent, then half the judges in this county should have stepped down years ago." Daniel's face turned pale. He looked from one judge to the other, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. Collins shifted his papers nervously, clearly realizing he had walked into a trap. Henry leaned back, folding his arms. "I've reviewed Tom's finances myself. Not a single discrepancy. Every bill paid, every account balanced. This petition isn't about concern, it's about greed." The room went silent. Daniel's eyes darted toward me, but for once he had no words. His carefully spun narrative was unraveling right in front of him. I slid a folder across the table, the one filled with records of every loan I'd given Daniel, every bailout I'd provided. Since we're discussing competence, perhaps we should also review the financial record of the man who claims he's fit to manage mine. Collins glanced at the documents and closed his briefcase slowly. He wasn't going to risk his reputation further. "I believe this meeting is concluded," he muttered, gathering his things. Daniel sat frozen, his smirk gone, his confidence shattered. For the first time he looked at me not as a man he could control, but as the father who had raised him, the man who still held the power he thought he could steal. I stood, buttoned my jacket and looked him in the eye. "You wanted me to sign away my life, Daniel, but you forgot one thing. I taught you everything you know." "Not everything I know." And with that, I walked out, my allies at my side, leaving Daniel to sit in the ruins of his failed scheme. The very next weekend, the family gathered again, this time at my niece's house for a Sunday dinner. I hadn't planned on attending, but Henry urged me to. "They need to see you," he said. "Not Daniel's version of you, the real you." He was right. Daniel's lies had flourished in silence, and now it was time to let the truth speak for itself. When I arrived, the usual hush fell over the room. Cousins glanced at me with careful eyes, and my sister looked torn between pity and doubt. But this time, I didn't shuffle in quietly or sit at the edge of the table. I walked tall, in the same suit I wore to Collins' office, my shoulders squared, and I didn't come alone. Henry walked in beside me, his presence commanding respect without saying a word. Daniel was already there, holding court as usual. He had a glass of wine in hand and was telling my nephews about the steps he was taking to protect me. He didn't notice me at first, but when his eyes finally landed on Henry at my side, The color drained from his face. I didn't speak right away. Instead, I let Henry greet the family, his firm handshake and steady smile drawing their attention. "Good to see you all," he said warmly. "I've known Tom for more than 40 years, still one of the sharpest men I know." That simple statement, delivered casually but with authority, shifted the room. Murmurs rippled across the table. My sister's eyes widened, and even my skeptical brother-in-law leaned forward, suddenly curious. Daniel fidgeted in his chair, the confidence he'd worn so easily beginning to crack. Finally, I stepped forward and set a folder on the table. "Since my son has been telling everyone I can't manage my own affairs," I said evenly, "I thought it only fair to show you the truth." I opened the folder and spread out documents, bank statements in perfect order, property deeds, and letters from colleagues and judges vouching for my competence. I didn't lecture, I didn't raise my voice, I simply laid out the facts, one page at a time, in front of the very people who had believed Daniel's lies. The silence was heavy, broken only by the sound of papers sliding across the table. My niece picked up one statement, her brow furrowing. "These are all up to date," she said quietly. My sister leaned over to read a letter signed by Judge Reynolds, her lips pressed together as she realized the weight of what she was holding. Daniel tried to interrupt. "Dad, this isn't," but Henry cut him off, his voice steady. "Daniel, I sat with Tom just last week. His mind is as clear as it's ever been. You're not protecting your father, you're exploiting him." That was when the whispers started. Not about me, but about Daniel. Cousins who had once nodded along with his stories now stared at him with suspicion. My brother-in-law muttered under his breath, "Unbelievable." My sister looked at her son with tears in her eyes, as if seeing him for the first time. Daniel's face twisted with frustration. "You're all being fooled. He's slipping. Can't you see it? He's just covering it up with these papers." His voice grew louder, more desperate, but instead of winning them over, it made him look exactly what he was, unhinged. I remained calm, folding my hands in my lap. "You wanted to make me look weak, Daniel," I said quietly. "But the truth is you've only shown everyone your own greed." The room fell silent. No one defended him. No one nodded in agreement. The very family he had tried to turn against me now looked at him with disappointment and disgust. For the first time since this ordeal began, the weight shifted. The shame was no longer mine to carry. It was his. I excused myself after dinner, leaving the papers behind for anyone who wanted to see them. As I walked out with Henry, I didn't need applause or vindication. The look on their faces was enough. My family now knew the truth. And Daniel, stripped of his lies, stood exposed in the harshest light possible, the light of his own blood turning their backs on him. That night, as I drove home, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Relief. Not because the fight was over, but because the tide had turned. Daniel had thought he could humiliate me in front of my family. Instead, he had only humiliated himself. If Daniel's lies had once been smoke in the wind, now the wind had changed direction. After that Sunday dinner, word began to spread, not from his mouth but from the lips of family members who had finally seen the truth. And in a small community like ours, once people start talking, there's no stopping it. It started at church the following week. I walked in, same pew I had always sat in, but this time the air felt different. Instead of pity, I saw respect in the eyes of those who turned to greet me. My pastor, who only weeks earlier had suggested I let others take the load, clasped my hand with genuine warmth. "Good to see you, Tom," he said firmly. And behind him, Judge McCarthy nodded, his presence like a stamp of authority. No one whispered that morning. They didn't have to, they knew. After the service, I lingered outside near the steps. A few men from the finance committee approached me, looking sheepish. "Tom, we may have been too quick to assume," one admitted, shifting uncomfortably. "Daniel made it sound like you weren't capable. We see now that wasn't fair." I didn't gloat. I simply said, better to know the truth late than never. But inside, I felt a small victory. The shift spread beyond the church walls. At the diner, where Millie had once hesitated to serve me, she greeted me again with the old warmth. "Coffee, Mr. Whitaker." "The usual?" she asked with a grin, sliding the mug across without waiting for my order. She leaned in and whispered, "Your son was in here last week, talking big about selling your house. Folks don't look at him the same anymore. Not after what they've heard." Even at the grocery store where Mrs. Parker had once given me those pitying looks, she now approached me with a different tone. "I'm sorry, Tom," she said softly. "I believed what Daniel told me. I should have known better. You've always been sharp as a tack." She squeezed my arm, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like an invalid in the eyes of my neighbors. I felt like myself again. But the most telling moment came at the country club, where Daniel loved to flaunt his supposed importance. I rarely went there anymore, but Henry suggested we stop by. As soon as we walked in, heads turned. Some nodded respectfully to me. Others avoided Daniel altogether. A man named Carter, who had been one of Daniel's golf partners, pulled me aside. "Tom, I don't know what your boy was thinking dragging your name through the mud like that. We've all seen your mind at work. He embarrassed himself more than you." I didn't have to say much. Daniel's own arrogance had already exposed him. He had told everyone too much, too soon, confident I wouldn't fight back. And now, with judges, documents, and witnesses proving him wrong, his story had collapsed under its own weight. At home, the phone started ringing. Old clients I had represented years ago called to check in, offering support. "If you ever need someone to speak for you, Tom, you know I owe you," one said. Even younger lawyers I'd mentored reached out. Word had spread fast. Daniel's petition wasn't seen as an act of concern anymore. It was seen for what it was, a greedy grab at power and money. The community shift wasn't just about clearing my name, it was about isolating Daniel. Where once he had strutted around town, playing the role of the caring son, now people saw through him. Invitations that used to include his name quietly stopped. Conversations dried up when he walked into the room. The same whispers that once painted me as weak, now painted him as selfish. A man willing to betray his own father for $1. And Daniel noticed. His swagger faded, his smile grew thinner, and though he still tried to spin his narrative, fewer and fewer people listened. I could see it in his eyes whenever we crossed paths. He was losing ground, not just in the family, but in the community that once gave him an audience. For me, the shift brought a strange sense of peace. I didn't need to shout or demand apologies. I simply had to keep living, keep showing the truth in everything I did. The community had chosen its side, and it wasn't his. Daniel had wanted to strip me of my dignity in public. Instead, the public had stripped him of his. The tide had already begun to turn in my favor. But the real reversal happened the day Daniel tried one last desperate push. He called me again, this time with a sharper edge in his voice. "Dad," he said, "we can still make this easy. If you sign the guardianship papers now, I'll make sure you're comfortable. You'll stay in the house for a while. I'll handle the accounts, and you won't have to worry about a thing." It was the same line, dressed in the same false concern, but I could hear the panic beneath it. His confidence was slipping. His community shield was gone. And all he had left was the threat of legal force. So I told him to come over. When Daniel arrived, I was waiting in my study. Henry sat across from me, arms folded with the thick folder of evidence at his side. Daniel swaggered in, but it was a weaker version of the confidence he once had. His eyes darted to Henry, then to the folder, and I could see him calculating. "Dad," he began, pulling out the papers once more. "Let's not drag this out. Just sign them. It'll protect everyone." I leaned back, steepling my fingers, and said nothing at first. Silence made him uneasy, and the longer I held it, the more his voice cracked when he added, "You know this is the best option." That was when I pulled out a second folder from my desk drawer, thicker than his. I slid it across the table slowly, my eyes never leaving his. "You've been telling everyone I can't manage my affairs, Daniel," I said, "but what they don't know is how many of yours I've managed for you." He froze. His hand hovered above the folder but didn't touch it. Henry opened it for him instead, laying the pages out like cards in a winning hand. Bank transfers, loan documents, promissory notes, all signed by me, all showing the countless times I had pulled him from the fire. $50,000 for your failed restaurant," I said evenly. $20,000 for your credit card debt. $10,000 to cover the car lease you defaulted on. I even mortgaged part of this house so you could chase another doomed venture. I let the words sink in, each one another nail in the coffin of his credibility. Daniel's face went pale. He sputtered, That's private, that's not relevant." I interrupted, my voice sharper now. "On the contrary, you claim I'm incompetent to manage money, yet I was competent enough to bail you out every single time you failed. Tell me, Daniel, who's the one unfit to manage finances?" Henry leaned forward, his tone cutting. "Tom's mind is clear, his accounts are solid, and his reputation speaks for itself. What do you have, Daniel? A pile of debts and a trail of failures." Daniel tried to protest, but his voice cracked under the weight of the truth. His arrogance was gone, replaced by desperation. For the first time, he looked small in the room where he had once tried to loom large. I stood slowly, buttoning my jacket, and walked around the desk until I stood face to face with him. "You thought you could take everything I built, everything I sacrificed, and claim it as your own, but you forgot who built it in the first place. You forgot who carried you, and now you stand exposed, not just to me, but to everyone you lied to." He didn't respond. He couldn't. The evidence was too overwhelming, the silence too heavy. Henry gathered the documents and placed them back in the folder with deliberate care. "This ends now," I said firmly. "Withdraw your petition. Admit to the court that your claims were false. If you don't, I'll file these records myself, and when the judge reads them, you won't just lose this case, you'll lose what little credibility you still have." Daniel's shoulders slumped. His head dropped. For a man who had once strutted with such arrogance, he now looked like a child caught in the act. Fine, he muttered, his voice barely audible. I didn't smile. There was no satisfaction in watching my son unravel, only a cold clarity. The power he had stolen, the respect he had stripped from me, had been returned, not because I shouted or begged, but because the truth, when revealed at the right time, crushes lies like glass underfoot. As Daniel left my house, shoulders hunched, I felt the weight lift from mine. For months, he had tried to turn the world against me. Now the world saw him for what he truly was, and in that moment, the balance of power shifted back where it belonged. I was no longer the man on trial. I was the man who had survived his own son's betrayal and taken back everything he tried to steal. It didn't take long for Daniel's retreat to ripple through the family. Word travels quickly, especially when pride and money are involved. Within a week of our confrontation in my study, the same relatives who once whispered behind my back began calling me tentative, hesitant, suddenly eager to smooth things over. It started with my sister. She phoned one evening, her voice careful as though stepping on fragile glass. "Tom," she said softly, "I think maybe we misjudged things." Daniel made it sound so convincing and I didn't know what to believe. I see now he might have been mistaken. Mistaken. That word hung in the air. No apology, no admission of how quickly she'd believed the worst of me. But I let her have her dignity. "It's all right, Margaret," I replied calmly. "We all learn who people truly are, sooner or later." I heard her sigh, relieved that I hadn't lashed out, and I knew then that the shift had begun. Next came Daniel himself. He showed up at my door late one afternoon, shoulders hunched, a far cry from the man who had once marched in with a lawyer and a smirk. He carried no papers this time, no allies at his side, just a pitiful expression that told me he had come not with power but with excuses. "Dad," he started, avoiding my eyes, "I think we got off on the wrong foot. I wasn't trying to hurt you. I thought maybe you needed help. Maybe I went about it the wrong way." The wrong way. He made betrayal sound like a minor slip, like tripping over a curb. I let him speak, though his words grew emptier with every sentence. "You know, with Mom gone, I didn't want you to feel overwhelmed. I was only looking out for you." I finally cut him off. "Looking out for me? You dragged my name through the mud. You humiliated me in front of family. You told neighbors and friends I was losing my mind, and when that wasn't enough, you tried to strip me of my independence in court. That's not looking out for me, Daniel. That's greed dressed up as concern." His face flushed, and for a moment I thought he might snap back, but instead he lowered his head. I just thought, maybe if I had control, things would be easier. "Easier for who?" I asked sharply. He had no answer. Other relatives soon followed his example, though in subtler ways. My brother-in-law, who once patted my shoulder with pity, came over with a six-pack of beer and said, "Tom, I never doubted you. I just didn't want to get in the middle of things." I almost laughed at the audacity. Never doubted me. He'd practically crowned Daniel the hero of the family a month earlier. But I kept my composure, offering a polite nod. "I appreciate the visit," I said, leaving the truth unspoken. At church, the pastor approached me again. "Tom, I may have been too quick to suggest stepping back from responsibilities," he admitted. "The congregation has great respect for you." Respect now, after questioning me when Daniel fed him lies. Again, no real apology, just backpedaling to save face. The only person who didn't stumble over excuses was Henry. He simply shook his head when he heard the stories. "Funny how quickly loyalty returns when the truth comes out," he muttered. He was right. Those who had turned away were now rushing to claim they had always stood by me. And Daniel? His begging grew more desperate with each passing day. He called. He showed up unannounced. He even sent me a long email full of excuses and half apologies. In every word I could hear the same fear. He had overplayed his hand, and now he was scrambling to salvage what was left. But here's the thing about betrayal. You can forgive, but you don't forget, and you certainly don't hand back the trust that was broken so carelessly. When Daniel sat in my kitchen one last time, pleading for us to put this behind us, I leaned across the table and looked him in the eye. "We may move forward, Daniel, but nothing goes back to what it was. You tried to strip me of everything I worked for. You can't erase that with excuses." His eyes filled with something I had never seen in him before. Not anger, not arrogance, but shame. He lowered his head, and for once Daniel had nothing left to say. After weeks of conflict, humiliation, and hard-fought victories, I realized that there was only one thing left to do. Close the chapter with finality. Not with rage, not with revenge, but with clarity and calm. Because if there's one thing I've learned in my 68 years, it's that real power doesn't always shout. Sometimes, it whispers. The moment came when I received a notice from the court that Daniel had formally withdrawn his petition. The very papers he once waved in my face were now null and void. That should have been enough, but I wanted to do more than just win legally. I wanted to send a message, not only to Daniel but to myself, that I was still in control of my life, my dignity, and my legacy. So I asked Daniel to meet me one last time. I invited him to my home. to sit across the same kitchen table where this entire ordeal had begun. He arrived looking worn, his arrogance stripped away, but still trying to mask his shame with forced politeness. He carried a thin folder, though I knew it no longer held any power. I had already prepared my own folder. Inside it I had placed the original petition he had filed against me, the very document that claimed I was incompetent. When Daniel sat down, I slid it across the table. His face tensed as he recognized it. "This is what you tried to reduce me to," I said quietly. "A piece of paper. A legal declaration that your own father was unfit to live his life." He opened his mouth to speak, but I raised a hand to stop him. Slowly, deliberately, I tore the petition in half. The sound of the paper ripping filled the silence between us. I tore it again and again until nothing remained but scraps scattered across the table. Daniel's eyes followed every tear. He looked smaller with each rip, like a man watching his illusion crumble into dust. I gathered the shredded pieces and slid them back toward him. "This is all your plan amounts to now," I said. "Scraps. Nothing of value. Nothing of substance." For a long moment neither of us spoke. He stared at the torn paper and I could see the weight of his choices pressing down on him. He had tried to strip me of everything, and now all he had left was a pile of nothing. I stood, walked to the fireplace in the living room and tossed the scraps into the flames. We both watched as the fire consumed them, the edges curling black, the words vanishing into smoke. That was the closure I needed. Not a courtroom verdict, not a shouted confrontation, but the quiet destruction of the very weapon he had tried to use against me. Daniel finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "Dad, I didn't mean..." He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. I turned to him. "You did mean it, and that's why this will never be forgotten. But I won't carry your actions like a chain around my neck. You tried to take my dignity, Daniel, but you failed, and now it's done." There was no anger in my voice, just certainty, and that certainty was what broke him more than any harsh words could have. As he sat there staring into the fire, I felt the last of my own burden lift. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need an apology. I needed to know that he could no longer hurt me, and that I had proven beyond doubt who I was. That night, after he left, I stood alone in the living room, the fire still glowing. I poured myself a glass of whiskey and raised it quietly to the memory of my wife. "It's finished," I whispered. For the first time in months, I felt peace settle over me. The petition was gone, my dignity restored, and the chapter closed, not with anger but with strength. In the weeks that followed, I came to accept a truth that many men my age eventually face. Apologies rarely come when they're owed. Daniel never stood in front of me, never looked me in the eye, and never said the words I deserved to hear. There was no "I'm sorry, Dad," no acknowledgement of the pain he had caused, but I didn't need his apology anymore. Because what I received instead was something far more powerful: recognition. It began with the community. At church, the pastor asked me to lead the finance committee again. He did so publicly, with the entire congregation watching. "We would be honored if you continued guiding us," he said from the pulpit. The murmurs of agreement, the nods from men and women who had once doubted me, were louder than any apology could have been. At the diner, Millie brought my coffee with a grin and said, "Sharp as ever, Mr. Whitaker." Her words carried no pity this time, only respect. The other regulars nodded, some even raising their cups in my direction. Daniel's lies had once followed me like a shadow, but now the truth walked ahead of me, clearing the way. Even my extended family, the same ones who had once nodded along to Daniel's stories, began to shift their tone. My sister invited me to her home one evening. As I walked through the door, she hugged me tighter than she had in years. "You've always been the strongest of us," she whispered. She didn't say she was sorry for doubting me, but her eyes told me everything. Doubt had been replaced by respect. My nephews and nieces, once so quick to assume their cousins' words were true, now came to me for advice. One asked me about applying to law school, another about investing. They looked at me not as an old man slipping into irrelevance, but as the figure I had always been, the steady hand, the man with wisdom earned the hard way. And Daniel? He avoided me. He showed his face at family gatherings, but the confidence was gone. When he spoke, his words were softer, careful, stripped of the arrogance that once defined him. He didn't apologize, but he didn't dare challenge me again either. And in his silence I saw the truth. He knew he had lost, and that loss would follow him longer than an apology ever could. What surprised me most was the recognition that came from outside my family. One afternoon I received a letter in the mail. It was from a young attorney I had mentored years ago. "Mr. Whitaker," it read, "I heard what your son tried to do. I want you to know that the entire legal community here stands with you. You're a man we all respect, and no lie could ever change that." I sat at my desk holding that letter, my hand steady. Recognition without apology. That was what this fight had given me. Daniel could never erase the years of sacrifice, the decades of hard work, the reputation I had built. And though he had tried to bury me under lies, he had only succeeded in showing the world the truth more clearly. Henry summed it up best one evening as we sat together on my porch. He sipped his coffee, looked out at the yard and said, "Tom, apologies are cheap. Respect, that's earned. And you've earned more of it now than ever before." He was right. I didn't need Daniel's apology to validate me. I had already been validated by the people who mattered, by the community that now looked at me with renewed trust, by friends who stood beside me, and by the quiet peace I felt in my own heart. I had walked through betrayal and humiliation, and I had emerged not weaker but stronger, not because my son made amends, he never did, but because I proved without a doubt that my dignity belonged to me, and no one could take it away. Recognition had come, respect had been restored, and that was worth more than any hollow words Daniel could have spoken. The storm had passed, but I knew better than to pretend life would return to what it once was. Betrayal, especially from your own blood, leaves marks that don't fade. Yet scars can be reminders too, not just of the pain, but of the strength it took to endure. I wasn't interested in clinging to bitterness. At my age, peace matters more than pride, and so I decided it was time to chart a new path, one that would define the legacy I wanted to leave behind. For weeks after Daniel's petition collapsed, my house was quieter. The silence felt different now, not heavy with suspicion or shame, but calm, steady, almost comforting. I spent more time on the porch, watching the neighborhood kids ride their bikes past the fence. Some of them waved, calling out, "Hi, Mr. Whitaker." I always waved back. In their innocent voices I heard something Daniel had long forgotten, respect given freely, not stolen or demanded. It struck me then that I had a choice. I could spend my remaining years dwelling on what my son had tried to do, or I could spend them ensuring my story didn't end with betrayal. I chose the latter. I began volunteering at the local community center, the same one where I had occasionally helped young lawyers prepare for the bar exam. This time, I expanded my efforts. I held weekly sessions on financial literacy, teaching people young and old how to manage their money, balance accounts, and avoid the traps of debt. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was meaningful, and every time a young man or woman thanked me for helping them avoid a costly mistake, I felt a satisfaction that Daniel's actions could never touch. The judges who had stood by me, Henry, McCarthy, and Reynolds, visited often. They joined me in mentoring law students, sometimes grilling them with the same sharp questions we once faced ourselves. The students were nervous at first, but eventually, they realized it wasn't intimidation, it was preparation. Seeing those kids grow, seeing them sharpen their minds under our guidance, reminded me why I had chosen law in the first place, to build, not destroy. At church, my role on the finance committee turned into something more. The pastor asked if I would speak one Sunday about resilience. I hesitated at first. I've never been one for sermons, but then I thought of the people who had once believed Daniel's lies. Maybe they needed to hear the truth about what it means to endure. So I stood at the pulpit, my hands steady on the wood, and told them not about betrayal, but about perseverance. I spoke of how dignity isn't something another person can take away, no matter how hard they try, and how truth always finds its way through. When I stepped down, the congregation rose in applause. That moment felt like redemption. As for Daniel, he kept his distance. He never apologized, never admitted what he had done, but his presence at family gatherings grew quieter. He no longer boasted or made himself the center of attention. Sometimes he wouldn't show up at all. When he did, he looked smaller, not physically, but in the way pride had been stripped from him. At first I thought the absence of reconciliation might haunt me, but in time, I realized I didn't need his apology to move forward. I had built my legacy long before his betrayal, and I would continue to build it long after. I also turned my attention to my will. For years it had been written with Daniel as the primary heir. That changed. I didn't do it out of spite, but out of clarity. I wanted my legacy to go to those who would honor it, not squander it. A portion went to the community center, to fund scholarships for aspiring lawyers who couldn't afford school like I once couldn't. Another portion went to my church, to help families in need, and the rest I divided among relatives who had shown loyalty and kindness, not the ones who wavered in whispers, but the ones who stood with me when it mattered most. It was my way of ensuring that when I was gone, the story of Thomas Whitaker wouldn't be defined by a greedy son's betrayal, but by resilience, integrity, and generosity. One evening, Henry and I sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon. He turned to me and said, "Tom, you could have let this whole mess break you. Many men would have, but you didn't. You turned it into something bigger, something lasting. That's legacy." I nodded, sipping my coffee, feeling the cool air settle over us. He was right. My legacy wasn't in the bank accounts Daniel had tried to seize, nor in the house he once schemed to sell. My legacy was in the lives I had touched, the lessons I had taught, the dignity I had reclaimed. As I closed my eyes that night, I thought back to the moment Daniel first laid those papers on my kitchen table, declaring I was incompetent. If only he could see me now, standing taller, stronger, more respected than before. He had tried to bury me, but all he had done was prove how unbreakable I truly was. The path ahead was clear. I would spend my days not in bitterness but in building, and when my story was finally told, it wouldn't be about a son's greed. It would be about a man who stood tall in the face of betrayal, reclaimed his dignity, and left behind a legacy no one could tarnish. That is how I chose to end the chapter. Not with anger, not with defeat, but with peace, strength, and a new legacy that would outlive us all.